They expected nostalgia. What they found was mutiny. Willie G's garage held more than memories. It held a secret that rattled Harley-Davidson to its core. Watch until the end, because the ending doesn't honor tradition. It challenges it. The hidden shrine. It was never supposed to be a spectacle. Tucked behind a nondescript industrial door on the outskirts of Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, Willie G. Davidson's private garage didn't even have a nameplate. No chrome signage, no company logo, just a steel door and decades of silence. But what lay behind it, once unlocked after his passing, wasn't just surprising, it was spiritual. Because this wasn't a garage, it was a shrine in steel. The family hadn't spoken much about it. Some relatives had never seen the inside, only heard whispers from decades earlier. How Willie liked to keep a few projects away from the spotlight. But when the executor of his estate finally turned the key, what they found wasn't a few dusty tools and some forgotten parts. It was a time capsule of an entire era of American motorcycling. Floor to ceiling, it was a sacred mosaic of Harley-Davidson history. Not the corporate polished kind, but the kind forged in grease and grit and human touch. There were motorcycles, of course, dozens of them. Some pristine, some unfinished, some covered in thick canvas as if protecting secrets too heavy for daylight. Every corner of the room seemed to breathe a quiet reverence. Old parts hung on hooks like relics. Jackets once worn to early unveilings were folded in crates. There were Polaroids pinned to the wall, each one fading, each one personal. A younger Willie laughing beside bikes that would go on to become icons. And in the middle of the room, beneath a hanging bulb that flickered just once as the power kicked on, sat the oldest piece in the room, his father's original knucklehead, untouched for decades. This wasn't a museum. Nothing had placards or labels. Nothing screamed for attention. Everything had been arranged by hand, by habit, by memory. There was a rhythm here, a personal system. Every bolt, every sketch, every grease-marked napkin taped to the wall told the same story. This was where the myth became a man again. For all his fame, Willie G had never let this space become performance. It was private, sacred, human. But as they began to lift the canvas off the bikes, one by one, a new kind of mystery emerged. Because beneath the reverence lay machines that no one, not even Harley-Davidson, had ever seen before. But beneath the dust, history wasn't the only thing hidden. There were ideas no one knew he had ever built. If this story's striking a nerve, like this video and drop a comment. Tell us what Willie G meant to you, or what Harley's legacy means now that he's gone. The prototypes no one knew. Some bikes tell their story at first glance. These did not. As the family and estate team removed the heavy coverings, they found themselves staring at motorcycles that defied categorization. A long-frame cruiser with split handlebars and a single-side suspension. A cafe racer with a carbon shell far ahead of its time. A fat-tire hybrid with dual chains, clearly experimental. None of them matched any production catalog, and none had been documented. It was as if they were staring at blueprints left behind. Physical drafts of dreams that never made it to the production line. Willie had always been known for his visionary approach to Harley-Davidson design, from the groundbreaking Super Glide in the early 1970s to the iconic Lowrider and Heritage Softail. But these bikes weren't iterations. They were wild departures, unregistered, unbranded, and unburdened by commercial constraints. Taped to the tanks or tucked beneath the seats were hand-scrawled notes. Some had color studies. Others listed materials never used in standard models. Aluminum lithium alloys, hand-bent titanium, molded leather dyed with crushed berries. These were not experiments in search of perfection. They were expressions, raw, unedited, and unfinished. Each bike looked like it had been created not for shareholders or trend forecasts, but for the thrill of imagination. There were signs these machines had been started, maybe even ridden in secret. Tires bore traces of old tread patterns. Brake lines had been bled, then clipped, yet none had been shown, registered, or even whispered about. Some seemed nearly ready to roll. Others were in stages of half-build, half-abandonment, with frames marked in chalk as if awaiting final judgment. This wasn't the work of a man making side projects. This was the work of someone still designing in secret, long after he was expected to stop. A man who, even in his final years, couldn't stop sketching motorcycles into the margins of his life. And amid the awe and confusion, one bike stood out, not for its ambition, but for its emptiness. Because in the back of the room sat one frame unlike the rest, bold, brutal, and missing its very soul. Everything we trust is linked below. Gear up before your next ride. The Engineless Ghost. There it sat. Against the far wall, beneath a sagging shelf of boxed memorabilia, was a motorcycle that had never roared. At first glance, it was beautiful, sleek, low-slung, and aggressively geometric. But a second glance revealed what made it truly haunting. There was no engine. The frame had been reinforced in all the right places. The swing arm was modified, possibly for something heavier than a traditional V-twin. The fork geometry hinted at something more aggressive, more powerful. The gas tank had already been custom cut, yet at the center where the heart of the bike should beat, there was only space. No engine nearby matched the mounts. No notes explained the absence. This was not a mistake. This was deliberate. It was a bike without a heart, and that absence said more than chrome ever could. In a room full of thunderous history, this machine whispered a truth too complex to name. Some who looked at it saw a missed opportunity, others a personal metaphor. Maybe it had been intended as a challenge to find the perfect engine. Or maybe in his later years, Willie had begun building not for performance, but for memory. Because legacy isn't just what we leave finished, it's what we begin and never complete. The Engineless Ghost was a question without an answer, and in that silence it spoke volumes. Was he searching for something new? Saying goodbye to the only language he had ever known? Or simply marking the place where a final idea had started but would never end? And just beside it, lying flat under a strip of old masking tape, was something even more intimate. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't structural. It was pure instinct, pencil on old wood, the last visual thought of a designer who never stopped drawing. And that's when they found the sketch that changed everything. Not just for Harley, but for what Willie G believed came next. The sketch on the bench. The workbench was cluttered, chaotic, and alive. There were tins of old hardware, a magnifier lamp, tubes of paint, and bolts sorted by color, not size. But what caught their eye wasn't any of that. It was the plank of plywood nailed to the back edge of the bench, used for decades to pin sketches, test swatches, and ideas too rough for the drafting room. Penciled directly onto the wood was a full-profile drawing. The lines were rough, overlapping. You could see where he'd erased and redrawn, refining angles, adjusting rake, lowering the seat. It wasn't labeled. No name, no brand, no build number, but it was unmistakably his. It was a motorcycle that defied eras. It blended the stance of a 1970s chopper with the minimalism of a modern street fighter. The tank was slim, the forks extended, and the rear hugged the road like a racer. It looked fast, lean, and hungry. A new direction, but drawn with old hands. And that's what made it profound. It was the last pencil stroke from a man who had defined generations of motorcycle design. Not intended for mass production, not for CAD rendering or committee critique. It was intimate, like a letter never sent. The vision of a man still wrestling with the line between tradition and rebellion. For decades, Willie G had led with bold strokes and sharp contrasts. Steel versus leather, power versus elegance, brand versus soul. But in that single sketch, he had done something simpler. He had drawn the next step without demanding anyone follow. The bench was silent. The sketch would never be scanned, sold, or finalized, but it said everything that needed to be said, that even at the very end, he wasn't finished. Not with the design, not with dreaming, not with Harley-Davidson. He left behind the lines. It's up to the rest of us to finish the ride. Because what came after the sketch wasn't closure, it was ignition. The tools, He couldn't let go. They weren't displayed. They weren't labeled. They were simply left, oil-stained, time-worn, and arranged with surgical precision across a scarred wooden bench. Dozens of tools, each bearing the weight of familiarity. Not one pristine, not one out of place. You could see it in the wrenches with polished grip points, in the screwdrivers ground down by years of torque. These weren't collectibles, they were confessions. Willie G. Davidson, the man who sculpted chrome into rebellion, had used these exact tools into his final years. Silently, ritualistically, obsessively. There was a certain grief in the detail. The softness of the cloth wrapped around the mallet's handle, the faded initials etched into the vice clamp. You could almost feel his hands, steady but fading, still reaching for the next adjustment. What he couldn't voice in a boardroom, he poured into steel, one bolt at a time. These weren't just instruments. They were how he spoke when the world stopped listening. And yet, just beside that bench, folded over the corner of an old crate, something else waited. Less mechanical, more personal. And it didn't fit. The jacket that didn't fit. It wasn't just any jacket. It was his jacket. Black leather, heavy stitch seams, custom lined. Iconic, but wrong. Too small. Too short in the sleeves. The tags inside revealed everything. It had been ordered again and again, each time tailored tighter. And inside the inner pocket, notes. Dozens of them. They were handwritten, rough and full of contradiction. One read, "They want a logo, not a man." Another simply said, "Shrink to fit the brand." The jacket hadn't been worn in years, yet it was kept here in reach. A reminder, maybe. Or a warning. The notes weren't designs, they were fragments of thought. A kind of quiet protest, hidden beneath the very symbol he helped make global. His son found it during the estate walkthrough and said nothing, just held it up, looked at the inside stitching, and folded it again. Because this wasn't about leather, it was about expectation, identity, the suffocating weight of becoming the emblem everyone else wears. But even that jacket couldn't hold what was smeared into the edges of the garage floor. Something less deliberate, more instinctual. Proof of a different kind of art. The paint on his fingernails. It was dry, faint, embedded beneath layers of time. But under the edge of the workbench and smudged into the buttons of a handheld buffer were streaks of paint, not from a factory but from his own hands. Deep burgundy, bright metallic blue, a flash of acid green. What started as a curiosity became a trail. In the far corner of the garage were miniature canvases, steel plates, bike tanks, fender scraps, each brushed with impossible precision, every stroke personal. This was not branding, this was bleeding. A different kind of expression, untethered from marketing briefs or dealership launches. Among them was one half-finished design, a tank split vertically, half classic Harley orange, half electric violet. Bold, disobedient, and next to it in faint Sharpie, "For the one who breaks the pattern." These weren't experiments, they were escapes. Willie wasn't just sketching machines, he was painting the feelings the machines couldn't carry. That's what those colors held. And somewhere between the steel and the streaks, a beat pulsed through the silence. It came from the far shelf, and it hadn't been touched in decades. The playlist on his garage radio. It crackled when they turned it on. A tape deck fused into the base of a rusted-out radio. Dust slipped off the plastic like peeling skin. The cassette was already inside, labeled in faded ink, "Shop Sunday." The music was nothing like what the public imagined of Willie G. No roaring anthems, no biker rocks. The playlist was haunting, soul, jazz, and an old gospel track layered with static and reverb. One song repeated itself twice on the tape. "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." It played just softly enough to hurt. For a man mythologized as industrial royalty, this was something entirely different. The soundtrack of solitude, of process, of reflection too quiet to post. Fans often wondered what Willie thought about his own legacy. This was it. Not a quote, not a press release, just a soundscape of a man designing alone, building alone, and thinking too far past his own era. When the final track ended, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred, because sometimes the loudest thing a man leaves behind is what he never says out loud. And Willie G. Davidson, the myth and the mechanic, left one question humming in that silence. Who was he really building for? The film reel nobody watched. They thought it was just paperwork, a sealed safe buried beneath stacks of old tax forms and rusted clamps. But inside lay something colder, heavier, a film reel labeled in black marker, "Don't show." Ever. No timestamp, no title, just grainy, uncut footage loaded into a rusted reel-to-reel player. A former documentary producer from Willie G's past was brought in to view it privately. What he saw silenced him. Not marketing reels, not ride footage, but raw, unfiltered shop days. Willie alone, sweating over rejected designs, muttering to himself about deadlines, friction, and fear. He wasn't the stoic designer the public knew. He was furious. At the compromises, at the silence from boardrooms, at himself. In one frame, he stares into the lens and whispers, "They'll never use this." But it's the only part that's real. The reel ended in static, but the silence it left behind was louder than any endorsement speech. It was never supposed to be seen. That was the point. And hidden between the spools of that tape was a thin envelope, one that didn't belong to the company. It belonged to blood. The letters with no return address. Tucked behind an old radio crate was a shoebox no archivist had cataloged. Inside, 27 envelopes, all handwritten, all addressed to a single name, Willie's daughter, who had stayed out of the spotlight for years. The letters were undated, some water-stained, some crumpled and rewritten. None had stamps, none had been sent. Inside, they revealed a man trying to explain without asking for forgiveness. He didn't write about motorcycles. He wrote about doubt, about how legacy can feel like a trap, about watching people clap for a version of you that no longer exists. One line read, "They say I built a brand, but all I ever wanted was to build a bridge to you." Each note was more vulnerable than the last. He wrote about the fear of not being remembered for who he was, but for who they needed him to be. When his daughter found them, she didn't cry. She just sat with them, reading slowly, as if each one rewound the man she had never fully met. But buried under the last letter was something that didn't belong in a box of emotions. It belonged in a courtroom, and it never got there. The will that changed nothing. It was informal, unsigned, and tucked between motorcycle magazine clippings in a rust-stained folder. A draft of a will, not the one filed with the estate. This one was different, messier, honest. It didn't speak in legalese, it spoke in frustration. There were no percentages, no line items, no trusty language, just a paragraph written in Willie's hand. If this gets read, and I doubt it will, don't split the legacy between lawyers. Give it to the kids who build with bare hands. He wasn't talking about his children, he was talking about apprentices, about young mechanics in underfunded programs, about giving tools instead of trust funds. The official estate plan never mentioned them. This document, had it been notarized, would have changed everything. But it wasn't, and so it didn't. To the legal team, it was inadmissible. To the family, it was a ghost. Yet within those ink-stained lines, something else was buried. A clue that Willie had left behind more than tools or tape. Something sculpted and completely out of place. The peace statue in the furnace room. No one ever noticed the furnace room. It was barely large enough to stand in. Cold, industrial, lined with old pipes and spare filters. But at the back, beyond the heater, sat a small sculpture, covered in cloth, untitled, unknown, unclaimed. When they pulled it into the light, no one could explain it. Welded from bike parts, brake rotors, fuel lines, exhaust bins, was a statue of two hands, palm up, fingers splayed, reaching toward a gear suspended above them. Balanced perfectly. Impossible to replicate. This wasn't public art. This was grief made mechanical. An offering, a surrender. No plaque, no explanation, just a single word scratched into the base. Peace. It didn't match the branding. It didn't match the myth, but it matched something else. Willie's silence, the kind of quiet that comes after decades of performance. Nobody claimed the piece, nobody tried to move it, because some things aren't meant to be filed or sold or displayed. Some things are left in the dark for a reason. And sometimes the last thing a man builds is the only time he tells the truth. The meeting Harley couldn't spin. The leaked email was never supposed to surface. It was buried deep, flagged internal eyes only, and dated just weeks after Willie G. Davidson's funeral. The subject line? Contain the narrative. Inside the Harley-Davidson boardroom, executives scrambled to assess the damage. The garage revelations weren't just personal, they were volatile. Unapproved builds, hidden correspondence, a shadow legacy too raw for PR, and someone inside had tipped off the press. The meeting minutes revealed panic in bullet points. Legacy risk assessment. Control messaging around unreleased designs. Avoid all reference to sculpture or cassette archive. But the real problem wasn't optics, it was ownership. Willie's garage had become a symbol, and symbols can't be copyrighted or silenced. Fans weren't buying merch, they were demanding answers. For the first time in decades, Harley's identity felt out of its own hands. Not because of a rival, but because of its own bloodline. Still, they tried to spin it until someone noticed an old patent quietly listed under a different name, one they thought they had buried. The patent everyone missed. Buried in a regional design archive in Wisconsin, a single-sheet patent resurfaced, dated 2011. Applicant name W. Davidson, not affiliated with corporate Harley, not filed through the usual channels. The document was minimal, just a sketched schematic and a product name, silent chain drive, variable tension geometry, an innovation no one in the company had claimed. A feature now standard in over half of Harley's new performance models. A retired engineer once let go during restructuring recognized it instantly. "That's Willie's," he muttered, holding the patent. "He showed it to me in secret. Said they didn't want anything that didn't make noise." Turns out they used it anyway. The filing had expired, the rights had lapsed, but the design had quietly found its way into production. No royalties, no credit. Just absorption. What began as a sketch of quiet rebellion had become the spine of Harley's loudest machines. And while most of the world never noticed, those who knew, those who built, felt the betrayal deep in their knuckles. Because not everything Willie left behind was unfinished. Some things had been stolen, and one man remembered exactly when. The ride that wasn't a ride. It wasn't documented. It wasn't televised. It happened one night in Arizona in the shadow of a custom builder's rally years before Willie passed. A legendary builder, gray beard, shaky hands, told the story like gospel. How Willie G had shown up unannounced. No entourage, just one bike, stripped down, experimental. He didn't ride it into the crowd. He rode it out into the desert alone. Said he needed to hear what it sounded like with no one else talking. The bike never came back. A week later, it was delivered, disassembled to a tiny garage in Phoenix. No instructions, just a handwritten note. "It's yours now. Just don't ride it like I did." The man never spoke of it publicly, until now. What made that story matter wasn't the mystery, it was the message. That maybe Willie's most important creation wasn't a machine, but an idea passed hand to hand, without press, without price. Because legacy isn't measured by what's marketed, it's measured by what survives the noise. And deep inside Willie's garage, sealed and dated, was one final artifact made for the future. The label said 2023, and it hadn't been opened. Still here? That means this matters to you. Subscribe now, because what's coming next might be the final chapter in Harley's downfall. The sealed box marked open in 23. The box was cedar, hand-built, sealed with brass hardware and corner brackets engraved with his initials. On top, in careful block letters, the inscription, "Open in 23." There was no lock, just intent. It was found by Willie's granddaughter, who had been helping catalog his memorabilia. The family debated for days whether to open it early. Some felt it should be preserved. Others argued the year had come. In the end, she made the call herself. Inside, folded in 3 layers of cloth, was a voice recorder, a printed letter, and a photo. Willie, in his 70s, standing beside a covered bike with a mischievous grin. The letter wasn't long. 1 page. It began with a sentence that stopped her cold. If you're reading this, then maybe the world still listens to a man who rides alone. The rest was part story, part challenge. He described a bike never revealed, a concept born from instinct and refusal. "I built something that doesn't need approval, doesn't need validation. It only needs one thing, to be ridden like it was stolen from the gods." The recording echoed that same spirit. His voice, slightly raspy, amused but unwavering, laid out why he waited. Legacy's a funny thing. If you chase it, it slips. If you ignore it, it grows. I didn't build a final bike. I built a final question. He ended with a pause. Then, if it still runs, ride it. If it doesn't, rebuild it. Either way, don't archive me. Outrun me. That box wasn't just a time capsule. It was a message across generations, a reminder that invention, rebellion, and courage don't belong to eras. They belong to people willing to open the box. Willie G's story ends in shadows, but the fallout didn't stop in that garage, because after his passing, something even more unthinkable happened. Harley killed its most iconic model. Go watch what really happened to the Sportster and why it may never come back. Like, comment, and subscribe. The legacy is still being written.